Och nu är det dags för oss att blicka utåt från landets gränser och höra från några kollegor i upphandlingsvärlden som jobbar i Storbritannien. Nu ska vi få höra från ett omfattande och spännande infrastrukturprojekt där hållbarhetsfrågor har varit i fokus. Av förklarliga skäl så kommer presentationen hållas på engelska. Vi kommer börja med en presentation och sen blir det en frågestund efter. So, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome our next speakers, Mike de Silva and Andrew Eldred. You dropped your mic, Mike. Welcome to our stage and welcome here to Stockholm. It's your first time for both of you. And last time we spoke, I think I promised you snow. And no snow, no show of snow here, sadly. But I can promise you last week, if you would have come last week, you would have seen a real winter wonderland that sadly rained away. But I've known you kept busy. You visited the ABBA Museum here yesterday.
Yes.
Great.
I grew up on ABBA, so it was fantastic.
Excellent. Yes. Well, this great group of procurement professionals and I want to make you feel extra welcome here in Stockholm. So a big round of applause again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Just a quick introduction of today's speakers. Begin with Mike, who has over 25 years of environmental and sustainability design and construction experience, much of which has been gained in the rail industry. He's worked on two of the largest rail link projects in the United Kingdom, one of which is Crossrail, which we will be talking about here today, and the other is High Speed 1, which you may have heard of. Mike has been working as a sustainability manager on Crossrail since 2009, and he's responsible for its sustainability strategy and reporting. Great to have you here.
Great, thank you.
And Andrew, who will be speaking in a bit, is head of employee relations at Crossrail, with responsibilities including trade union engagement, oversight of contractors' management of site employment relations, and the delivery of apprenticeships commitments. And before joining the Crossrail's program, Andrew held several senior employment relations roles in the construction industry, including the London 2012 Olympic Park construction. Interesting. Very happy to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, hopefully everyone can hear me. My microphone fell on the floor, and I'm not sure if it's working.
We're good.
Is that okay?
We're good. Great.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, and it's a real privilege to be here with you, speaking to you today. We entertained some of your colleagues about 2 years ago now in London, in far less glamorous surroundings than this, but we had some members of the Public Procurement Department and also from Traffic Verket who were keen to come to London and learn a little bit about our experiences, which we're very proud of. But equally well, I'm sure that you've got some great practice here in Sweden, so we very much welcome the opportunity, and perhaps that will come up in questions, to hear a little bit about your approach to dealing with some of the complex challenges that we have in delivering public infrastructure. So let me start. First of all, a little bit about Crossrail. It's around 120 kilometers from the west here. Is my pointer working?
Pointer to screen.
Yeah.
At the computer.
Oh, at the right. Oh, it was the pointer, the red pointer. Yeah. So about 120 kilometres from here to Shenfield in Essex and Abbey Wood in Kent, and here we have central London. Now, this section here in dark blue is on existing railway line, which is being upgraded and electrified to take the new Crossrail trains. Similarly, for this section and this little section here, the red section through central London, going into East London, Stratford, where the London Olympics took place, and out here into East London through the London Airport area, and just across the river here, consists of 22 kilometres of brand new tunnel and 8 new underground stations which interlink with the existing network. Just a little bit here again to see it's a phased opening. It's a very complex project, as you can imagine. We have a phased opening, and the various stages of opening, as you can see, are depicted on that figure there, just to give you a little bit of an idea. Now, when we're delivering sustainability on a project like this, where does one start? And we decided that a strategy was a very good place. Now, in terms of putting that strategy together, we looked at the time at our two main project sponsors' requirements, or basic themes that they were looking at. These come from the Department for Transport and Transport for London, who are, as the project sponsors, are the main funders of the project. We also do have some private sector funding that comes into it. Now, again, just to give you a bit of a flavour for this, again, I think the slides will probably be available,
yep.
Will they? So you can look at this in more detail. Oops, excuse me. But we have here the UK government themes, and then the Transport for London sustainability themes. And what we did is we looked at themes that we believed were what we would call material, have a material impact on Crossrail, and we developed these 7 themes here. Now, they basically, you can see with these linkages, although the language that we use, the way we describe these might be slightly different, they basically do reflect the government and Transport for London themes. And then we went even more granular, a little bit more detail around this, and that is depicted by the various green oval shapes here, which again reflect things around economic performance, for example, a high-performance railway delivered on time, minimizing whole life costs and so on. We have the health and safety and well-being elements. We have the environmental elements here, and the skills and employment and community investment part as well, which Andrew will talk about a little bit more as we go on. We also have 3 important cross-cutting themes, and this is our governance, responsible procurement, and our learning legacy. An important part of what we did very early on as well was preparing the supply chain to be able to deliver these rather onerous requirements on Crossrail. With successive projects, we've actually raised the bar in terms of requirements. So it was very important that the supply chain was able to respond to this. So there was a lot of early work undertaken to prepare the supply chain, and that work actually continued as well during the course of the construction work as well. We went out, we had what we would call road shows, where we went out to the various regions around the UK and made sure that the supply chains were aware of the opportunities that Crossrail was providing, and giving them the right information to prepare and to be able to bid for opportunities on the project. So there were a number of different activities that took place, and importantly, these were supported by the senior management team. It was the senior management team, our procurement director, CEO, chairman, who would actually go to the regions to show that we were actually serious about delivering this, and making sure that it wasn't just London and the southeast of England that benefited from Crossrail, but there were opportunities within the supply chain throughout the UK. Now, where are these opportunities for suppliers? There's a lot of, oops, I keep pressing the wrong button. There are a lot of dots. There are hundreds and hundreds of dots. Each of those dots there represents one unique procurement opportunity. And if we look at the figures there, you can see there is quite a grouping, a preponderance of contracts in the southeast there, but also you can see other areas of activity here in the Midlands, some up there in the northeast, up in Scotland, some in Northern Ireland, and so on. So there were opportunities throughout the country, and in fact, 64% of the contracts that have let have been outside of London and the southeast. And that translates in terms of value also to a similar value of about 65 to 66% of value outside of London and the southeast, and also to small and medium enterprises. These are the companies that we really want to encourage to be able to get onto our supply chains. Our rolling stock, our trains, again, has been a tremendous success story. And a very important aspect of this is actually through successive generations of rolling stock design, they've tended to get heavier and heavier. Now, this is a real enemy for us in terms of a metro-style service, which has constant stopping and starting. And that inertia that you have from starting up those trains every time is a huge killer as far as energy consumption is concerned. So we set a weight target on the rolling stock that the designers and and the delivering company Bombardier were able to satisfy. And that has reversed this trend in increasing train weights. So that's been very important to us. They also have some very good energy saving features such as regenerative braking. We also have what we call intelligent hotel loads, which monitor carefully the air conditioning requirements, the comfort cooling requirements, and basically make sure that that's working very efficiently. There are also a thing called a driver advisory system, so that the drivers know what their driving patterns are and then can moderate their driving patterns as well to make sure that they are driving those trains as efficiently as possible. Another key aspect of it as well is the signalling within the central section under London. It's automatic train operation, so it's very hands-off as far as the drivers are concerned. So as long as we have a reliable signalling system, we should get very good efficiency of trains through that. That keeps up our timetable, but also has significant energy-saving benefits as well. Now, just in terms of our supply chain, as you can see, very international, including some electrical systems from Sweden. But I think this is very typical of the globalized procurement that we have now, and the fact that components come from various parts of the world, which brings along with it its own challenges, particularly with regard to responsible procurement of those elements, and an area that we're particularly concerned around, which is the ethical sourcing of those component parts. So tunneling under London, we had 8 of these machines, 7.1 meter diameter tunnel boring machines. Each of these machines is about 140 meters long, and are basically self-contained factories that will chew through the earth and insert the segmental liner. Material transport was a very important aspect of this. We wanted to make sure that we were getting some beneficial use from this material and not just dumping it. So we have from our tunnel boring machines here into material stockpiles, transport then by train to a jetty facility, and then taken by shipborne transport, and you can see some of our ships there, to this area here called Wallasey Island on the Essex coast, which is a project that we've been involved with jointly with the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and is now recognized as a site of European importance as far as migratory birds are concerned. So it has a significant biodiversity and ecological benefit, but also actually does help us to mitigate against climate change impacts, because this part of the coastline is quite subject to seawater rise and flooding. And this area is now able to absorb a lot of that tidal energy, and thereby protecting some of the surrounding landmass. That's Wallasey Island as it is now, as we've been progressing with that project. I should say that Crossrail is only involved in delivering phase 1 of the project for the Royal Society for Protection of Birds. There are several other phases to come, and there are some other major projects in London, such as the Thames Tideway Tunnel, which is called the Super Sewer, a new sewage network for London. There's the possibility of a Crossrail 2, a north-south railway. There's also the London section of High Speed 2. So all these projects are going to be vitally important in delivering more material to Wallasey Island to complete that project and make sure that we're using the material as beneficially as possible. This is what the project will look like in 2019, artist's impression there. Managing construction impacts is another key thing for us. I mean, we're in central London. Some of the challenges you'll have here as well in Stockholm and some of your other major cities. We're right in the heart of the communities with very tight construction sites, so there's a lot of construction impacts, and these are some of the things that are most pertinent to people, because they do affect them every day. We've had a big focus on dust and air quality and noise. The main point I would like to probably highlight in terms of dust and air quality is the use of diesel particulate filters for our on-site equipment. Now, the industry was saying this can't be done, but we stuck by our conviction that we could make sure that as we were bringing equipment onto site, that it did have the diesel particulate filters or a higher category engines, which were cleaner burning engines. And we had to work very closely with the manufacturers and insurance companies as well to make sure that the warranties on the equipment weren't invalidated by retrofitting some of this equipment. We've now fitted 86% of our equipment on site has this feature, so it can be done, and that's been a very a major success for us. Noise as well. Don't underestimate the amount of time that it takes to get all your noise mitigation systems in place. You obviously have to make sure that you're using the most appropriate equipment for the job, but we also have had to provide things like secondary glazing, and in some cases re-homing people either for temporary respite, this is for short period of times, or actually moving them away into temporary rehousing for longer periods of time while very noisy works are being undertaken. If you're dealing with things like listed buildings, for example, which have statutory designation, getting the approvals in place to do things like the secondary glazing can take a very, very long time by the time you do the surveys, get the approvals and so on. So very important to understand where those impacts are going to be and manage them. Carbon reduction, again, another big thing on our agenda. And again, we have done a number of different things, but there are a lot of small things that can be done. Increasingly, manufacturers are bringing more energy efficient equipment onto site, or making it available, I should say. We have to create the market, we have to create the demand so that it makes it viable for these technologies to be used. And big projects like Crossrail have the procurement power because we require such a large number of these bits of equipment that we can actually make it more cost effective to come onto the market. And the message that we're actually getting from the suppliers is that once they come onto a project like Crossrail and they're now off-hired onto other projects, they can go on to smaller projects which normally wouldn't have the same procurement power to be able to get those particular pieces of equipment onto site. So it demonstrates how big projects like Crossrail can be very important enablers for industry. We've looked at the sustainability of the materials as well. So each element, and this is just, again, just depicts this, different component parts of our station, and we've looked at a number of different environmental impacts on those and come up with a classification system whereby the architects were required to only go for the products there that were identified in green. It's like a traffic light system, we call it red, amber, green. Amber they could use under specific circumstances, and reds were they couldn't use them at all. Those specific circumstances might be, for example, where there's a particular performance or safety consideration in the use of those materials. And so ultimately we're hoping that with a number of these various features we can have sustainable designs. We're using two assessment methodologies, one called Sequel, which has recently been used in Sweden for the first time to assess the overall sustainability, environmental sustainability performance of these buildings. We're also using another scheme called BREEAM as well, the Building Research Establishment Environmental Assessment Methodology to evaluate our stations. Projects like this also provide a fantastic opportunity to improve the urban realm around the station developments. And just to illustrate this, this is in an area of London just off Oxford Street. For those of you who are familiar with that, an area called Hanover Square. And this is the Bond Street station. It was an old Georgian town square, and you can see some of the old Georgian buildings there. That's in fact a listed Georgian building. And in the 1970s, some of those buildings were demolished, and 1970s office blocks were built in their place. Our new station is now going in this location, so these two buildings have been demolished, and the station will be built there, the underground station with the oversight development. That is the oversight development now with the station entrance at this level, at street level. And look at the difference between the old urban realm setting, very much for vehicles, but now we have a much better shared road space, which is pedestrian and cyclist friendly, as well as facilitating access for vehicles. So a great enabler to improve the urban realm. I mentioned responsible procurement and ethical sourcing. This is another area that we're very proud of, that we've shown some leadership to the industry on this. Just recently, in 2015, just over a year ago now, we had the introduction of a thing called the Modern Slavery Act as well, and this has put a renewed focus on looking at areas of ethical sourcing. Very, very complex. This requires us as a client, or our tier one contractors who are actually purchasing these materials for us and purchasing labor services, to look right the way through their supply chain and ensure that there's no slave labor in that supply chain. I mean, you know, how do you go about doing that? It's an it's an incredibly complex area. Some of our supply chains are quite short if we're looking at something like concrete or steel, but when we're looking at ventilation equipment, things like fans and so on, what we call our mechanical and electrical, the components come from so many different parts of the world. As I say, it's the same sort of challenge that we have with the rolling stock. So a very, very complex area. But we've been working our way through this, and we've developed some things called commodity sheets, which identify the various key issues associated with these different materials and what we can do to try and de-risk those in our supply chain. The road safety initiatives as well. We've had a huge program around road safety. Now, tragically, and you will hear this from time to time in London and also in other big cities in the world, there have been a number of collisions, including large vehicles and cyclists. And it tends to be where in the UK where the vehicles are doing a left turn. Here it would be a right turn, and they don't have visibility of cyclists. So we've had a huge awareness program. All the vehicles are fitted with a number of safety features as well at considerable expense, but we felt it was an investment that was well worth it for preventing accident and injuries and fatalities on the street. So again, just some figures there about the length and breadth of the training that we've provided. Again, we can give you some more information on this if you like, following the presentation. And now, at that point, I'm handing over to Andrew so that was a bit of an umbrella view of what we were doing, and Andrew will now focus a little bit more. I think the reason that you're really here, which is to understand a little bit more about the skills and employment objectives.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, yeah, I'm going to talk about skills and employment objectives, and I'm coming at it very much from the perspective of somebody with a background in employment, in HR, rather than procurement. I wasn't involved in the early days, so some of the background I'm going to give you probably, to be honest, wasn't necessarily all of it factored in by the people who designed all of this. And so I think one of the big lessons probably is to get that dialogue earlier on between the people in the early stages of the project, the procurement people, maybe to a certain extent the corporate social responsibility people, and the people who've actually got to implement it. So that's one of the big lessons learned, but we can come to that in a sec. So yeah, I'm going to look at the role and limitations of procurement in driving skills and employment objectives on the project. And the key themes really, and this is really to provide a context, hopefully a context for the discussion we have afterwards, because I'm not sure to what extent our context in the UK matches your context in Sweden. I suspect there are some significant differences. But within the UK, historically, little support for good social skills and employment practice. I'll talk a little bit about that and its origins in the 1980s in a sec. So what we've had to do is put specific skills and employment commitments into the contracts, and I'll talk about how we did that. And implementation hasn't been straightforward, and I'll be honest with you, it hasn't been universally successful. Again, an area for lessons learned. I'll also talk a little bit about what's happening in the UK now, and what's been happening over the last few years, because there has been a bit of a shift, and arguably it's becoming a more welcoming environment for skills and employment objectives than it was at the time that these objectives were being designed for the Crossrail project. Okay, yes. She's looming over all of us. Basically, what happened in the 80s and early 90s was a dismantling a lot of the institutional supports for skills and employment in the United Kingdom. We used to have, in public procurement in the United Kingdom, what were called social clauses. And they were mainly centered around recognition of trade unions, use of trade union labor. That had a skills dimension because the apprenticeship system in the United Kingdom was very closely associated with collective agreements with trade unions, which is, of course, one reason why this lady over here didn't like them. And so what we ended up was those social clauses over time became illegal. You were not allowed to put those clauses into commercial contracts, and value for money became the watchword. And the private sector construction industry jumped into that with both feet because it enabled them to undercut the public construction organisations. So a lot of local councils, a lot of government departments lost their direct labour organisations. Everything became driven by the market. Also, that was obviously reinforced latterly with the EU, picking up on a lot of this sort of liberalising tendency from America and the United Kingdom. However, even within that environment, even within the 1990s environment, there were opportunities for authorities that were so minded to support skills and employment. One was in terms of planning permission of the Town and Country Planning Act. Section 106 allowed local authorities to impose conditions on developments, and a lot of them smuggled in skills and employment requirements through that mechanism. And the public sector equality duties, the duty on public sector organisations to promote equality and diversity. If you remember back to Mike's original chart with the various sort of boxes describing the elements of sustainability strategy with different organisations, skills and employment stemmed from equality duties. So in terms of skills and employment in the UK, as I said, it's not necessarily a particularly friendly environment. Intense competition. I think in Sweden you've probably got 3 or 4 large construction companies who, let's face it, get most of the big jobs. In the UK, I would say there are a dozen, maybe 2 dozen companies competing for that work, and beneath them hundreds, thousands of other organisations. And within the UK, much more so than elsewhere in Europe, and even more so than in the United States, a huge amount of subcontracting. The amount of direct delivery carried out by companies like Skanska in the UK is tiny. Skanska in the UK employs about 5,000 people. How many construction workers does Skanska actually employ? People who do the work in the UK. About 60. About 60. Most are at professional, managerial level. Everything else gets subcontracted out. What that means, of course, is that its employment is fragmented, and responsibility for training people, employing people is fragmented, and it largely sits with small organisations that, quite frankly, don't have the time, the resources, or the profit to invest in it. You've got weak sectoral institutions, relatively weak trade unions. There are collective agreements, but they're largely disregarded. There are training institutions, national training institutions, regional training institutions, but they tend to be fairly badly resourced, have relatively little influence, and are limited in what they can achieve. So the product of that is you get uneven investment in skills. At the top end, heavy investment in professional managerial skills, but in terms of the people actually doing the work, you have a large reliance on semi-skilled, unskilled labour. Jobs in the UK are much more labour-intensive than they are in Sweden and elsewhere in Europe, with a much greater emphasis on civil engineering, unskilled, semi-skilled labour. Not so much investment in off-site fabrication as well. Low quality of much of the training, really related to the weakness of institutions. And so what we have in the UK is persistent skills shortages, comparatively low productivity. Our productivity is appalling in comparison with many other parts of Europe. A poor industry image, and I say unimpressive diversity record. In terms of diversity, you look at the workforce and you could say, well, actually it's very diverse. And that's because, of course, we rely heavily on immigration. So it's not because we've done anything, particularly, that we have a very ethnically diverse workforce. It's because we've done nothing other than let everyone come into the country. And of course, it's very easy to enter the labour market in the UK because there are so many of these unskilled, semi-skilled jobs. In terms of diversity for women, we're the worst in Europe. About 10% of the industry workforce are women, which is far lower than in Sweden, for example. And on site, in terms of site skills, about 1% of the site workforce is female. So, it puts a big emphasis on the big projects to do something about it. And what we've got with Crossrail is a very large project, as Mike says, about £15 billion with a national profile, going through lots of different local council areas. And so what you got when the Crossrail Act was going through Parliament was a great deal of activity from those communities demanding something back in return for the inconvenience of the project going through their communities. And so a lot of undertakings, lots of promises were made in the course of the passage of the Act. Genuinely, there were concerns about skills shortages in the particular area, and it's not surprising it's particularly important in this respect. The particular area of concern was tunnelling skills, because there hadn't been a lot of tunnelling going on in the UK for a very long time. And so tunnelling skills was a clear priority in terms of the project. We had the example of London 2012. You'll probably recall a large part of the selling of London 2012 to the International Olympic authorities was the benefits to East London, the skills and employment opportunities. So we had that precedent. And so what you ended up with in 2010, long before I was on Crossrail, was a skills and employment strategy. A number of commitments made. One was setting up this entity here, which is the Tunnelling Underground Construction Academy, where they have taught a number of apprenticeships and other courses around spray concrete lining tunnelling, TBM tunnelling, and related areas. A commitment, although not in numbers, to provide job opportunities to local and unemployed people. Numerical commitment to 400 apprentices. I don't know whether apprenticeship is the term you use in Sweden, but apprenticeship, a job with training usually for younger people. 350 work placements, fairly long, 3 weeks to 3 months periods of experience in work, again really targeted towards younger people, and some general commitments around the area of diversity. So how do we actually put that in place? This is where we get to the meat, if you like, of the procurement. Contractual requirements. And believe it or not, this is the first big project in the UK actually to put numerical, specific requirements into contracts around skills and employment. On the Olympic Park, the ODA, who I worked for, made commitments, but there weren't actually those commitments in the contracts, which was a little bit alarming, actually delivering what we had. Crossrail's innovation, if you like, was putting them in. And the way they put them in was you had a certain number of commitments calculated according to the value of the contract. So for every £3 million of contract value, there had to be a deliverable, a skills or employment deliverable. What that deliverable was fairly broadly defined, although half of those deliverables either had to be a job start, a job for a local or unemployed person, or an apprenticeship. The other 50% could be a range of things, work placements, work experience, upskilling for members of your existing workforce, and so on and so forth. Another contractual commitment, all job vacancies had to be advertised through what we called the Crossrail Jobs Brokerage. Now, that was established with the local employment service, Job Centre Plus, largely staffed by Job Centre Plus employees. And in the contract, every employer, whether it be a Tier 1 contractor or anybody in their supply chain, had to advertise any vacancy through the brokerage. Whether they did or not, that's another thing, but we'll come to that later. Everyone had to work towards a standard around diversity called Diversity Works for London. Unfortunately, with that, Diversity Works for London closed soon after we'd let the contracts. And so that was an area that we struggled really to make up for. And also, and this was important, to involve the supply chain in delivering those requirements. The bulk of the employment, as I've described already, sits not with those tier 1 contractors, with the Skanskas, the Costains, and so on. It sits with the lower tier employers, and they're traditionally the hardest ones to reach. So, in terms of implementing, a lot of implementation issues. One was around prioritizing objectives. As I said, apart from apprenticeships and job starts, the whole load of other things that contractors could do. In addition to that, there were lots of other things that Mike's already described, other things that we were having to police. And I say police because my team's role was there to ensure that the contractors delivered on what was in the contract. And my team, for this purpose, consisted of 2 people. And there were, at one stage, I think 28 contracts that they were having to monitor, 28 sets of distinctive contractual requirements. And that was tough. That was tough. In reality, the priorities were the priorities I've already identified. It turned out really to be around apprenticeships and around local jobs. And overcoming resistance and inertia, as you'll know, putting something in a contract doesn't mean you get it. It's about implementing it, monitoring it, and shaming people into actually doing it. And so, again, there was a big issue around that. Fortunately, through the government's mechanisms that Mike has described, through the support we had at a very senior level, and through some of the other processes that we had, we were able to get the contractors at least to deliver what was contractually required. Boosting subcontractor and labour agency participation. Again, although that was in the contract, it took a lot of work. And one of the things that we had to do was sort of sit with contractors and say, well, you've got these commitments. How are you going to do what Crossrail has done by passing those down into the contracts? Originally, a lot of the Tier 1 contractors thought that they could deliver most of those commitments themselves. So about 70–75% of all the apprenticeships in the first few years actually came from the Tier 1 organisations. So they tended to be apprenticeships in what they did. So in terms of quantity surveyors, in terms of professional level engineers. There are very few actually in that workforce where the skills need is greatest in terms of the subcontractor workforce. So getting them to enforce those and again implement those was important. Safeguarding quality. Our contracts did not say how you went about getting the deliverables. We said, this is your target, this is your commitment. There was very little in the contract about how you went about it. And to be frank, some contractors went about it better than others. And some took the easy way through low-level, low-quality apprenticeships, for example. Others did not. And so differentiating that was something above and beyond the original contract, and that's something we had to work on quite hard. Difficult areas. Well, diversity became a difficult area because in the end we had nothing in the contract around diversity. I think more pertinent for today, the difficult area was around jobs. In terms of the contractors had certain obligations around a certain number of job starts and a certain number of jobs created. But there were all sorts of other conflicting pressures as well. And where we ended up with was, I think, a lot of the political drivers around jobs, the emphasis on local people getting employment, tended to overtake the emphasis on focusing on the longer-term unemployed. There were attempts in the early days, through pre-employment training and so on, to get long-term unemployed people into work. But they didn't work, and there were various reasons why they didn't work. One was the selection of people to attend those courses. Well, there wasn't much of a selection. They were on the long-term unemployment register, they went on a course, they weren't terribly interested, they hadn't taken a drug and alcohol test, and when they got a drug and alcohol test, they failed it. And the employers weren't involved in the process either. And so one of the things latterly we had to do was look at that whole thing again and say, well, how do we involve the employers? How do we get the individuals motivated? And how do we get actual jobs out of this process? And that's a much more labour-intensive and demanding exercise. We can talk about later, perhaps, if it's of any interest. Much more labour demand and exercise than we originally had planned for. Managing performance. One of the main initiatives, innovations on Crossrail, was a thing called Performance Assurance Framework. So we actually set a framework up, and it wasn't just for this area, there are other areas such as commercial, such as environmental, such as health and safety, where rigorously every 6 months we assessed the contractors against what was called basic compliance, so compliance with the contract, but then some higher level, above basic compliance criteria, and then what we called world class, which was, if you like, way beyond the contractual minimum. Now, as you can see, a lot of contracts struggled even to get to basic compliance, but there were others, and we tried to use those as exemplars to drive better performance around the contractor community more widely. And recognition and reward, awards and so on for apprenticeship employers, awards for innovation in the area of diversity, in the area of jobs. It all helps. Outcomes. Well, numerically, I think we achieved what we set out to achieve. So 4,706 job starts, that's local people getting jobs. About 1,000 of those were previously unemployed. How many of them were long-term unemployed? I can't tell you, because 80% of the jobs came from the lower tier contractors, and to get information about the background of each of those individuals through all those layers of the supply chain proved impossible. So I can't tell you how many of those were short-term unemployed or long-term unemployed. 602 apprenticeships, say the target was 400, 496 work placements, 350 was the original target. Diversity outcomes mixed. In terms of BAMI, Black, Asian, Minority Ethnic, which was the main race ethnic-based diversity group that we were targeting, fairly high, but then again, London is a very diverse city. In terms of women, gender, not particularly impressive. Again, as with the jobs initiative, what we then had to try and do was have something more targeted, more focused. And so what latterly we did, we partnered with an organisation called Women into Construction, who I knew from the Olympic Park. And what they do is they arrange work placements for women interested in construction careers, maybe partly qualified. What they struggle to do is get the opportunity, get the exposure, get the networks. And so what Women in Construction were able to do was to find work placements for those women, and there was a high level of conversion from works placements into apprenticeships and into jobs, but fairly small scale, 30 or 40 women into jobs. It needs to be scaled up. Now, if you do it from the beginning, from the outset of the job, you can scale it up. We were doing it towards the end. And latterly, the focus shifted to quality of apprenticeships, really not just the level, but also how systematically are people recruited, what's the mentoring like, what's the retention like, what's the ongoing development like, and again, pushing and pushing and pushing on supply chain participation. Some successes, some contractors have achieved very high levels of supply chain participation. Others, Skanska, for example, very low. Lessons learned. Lessons learned. I think establish clear priorities. I think looking back with hindsight, the sheer range of things that my team had to monitor, that the contractors had to think about, that our teams had to think about was so broad that I think we struggled to maintain focus. You need to have a clear idea of what you're looking to achieve. I say employ a variety of mutually reinforcing mechanisms, especially in difficult areas. Get it in the contracts, absolutely. Performance manage, absolutely. But I think in the difficult areas, there's got to be more direct involvement as well. Whether that be through some of the initiatives we did around, in the later day, around women into construction, and also in the area of jobs. What we ended up doing in jobs was we had what was called a job guaranteed training scheme. So we got 1 or 2 employers on board. They identified a skills gap that they wanted to fill that was relatively easy to fill, entry-level type jobs, basic skilled jobs. We went out, we pre-assessed candidates, we got candidates who'd passed the drug and alcohol test and demonstrated a level of interest. We got them interviewed by the employer. Once the employer had identified people that they quite liked the look of, basically, if those people completed the training course, they had the job. That led to very high levels of motivation and high levels of success. But again, small scale needs to be scaled up. It was too late for us to do that. Use stick as well as carrot. There were no commercial incentives, there were no commercial penalties for not doing this stuff. All we had was the ability to shame people, embarrass people, maybe the chairman of Crossrail shout at their chief executive down the phone. But actual commercial incentives or penalties, I think, worth considering. And know your limits. Know your limits. We're doing this within the context of a very fragmented industry, an industry where the institutions that surround it are very weak. You can only achieve so much. And I think one of the things that the big clients need to think about more is not what can we do on our project in a self-contained way, but what can we and other clients do to build up those broader industry institutions so that they become self-sustaining, rather than big projects having to invent something new every time. And it's getting better. And this is my last slide. It's getting better in that the legislative, the statutory environment is becoming friendlier. We have something now, 2012, so long after Crossrail procured its contracts, we have something called the Public Services Social Value Act 2012, which allows public authority procurers to put social goals, social objectives in to procurements. Uniquely for the United Kingdom, we implemented an EU directive early, rather than on the last possible day. The EU 2014 EU Procurement Directive, we implemented it very early. And again, that's a further loosening the ability for public authorities to factor in social and broader goals in. Our Public Procurement Authority has issued a couple of policy notes on putting apprenticeship and other skills and employment targets into contracts, like a how-to guide. You can get those on the internet. And the broader policy perspective, the broader policy context has changed in that the government now recognises that we've got a problem, not just in construction, but elsewhere in the UK, which is we're not training people. We've relied largely on immigration, other countries to train people, and then we take them. But in terms of training our own population, we've been sorely lacking in that for many, many years. So there's a target of 3 million apprenticeships over the next few years. And transport infrastructure, which is where Crossrail sits and a lot of where you sit, the UK transport infrastructure clients. So Crossrail, HS2, the big project going up to the north, Transport for London, Highways England, who build a lot of the roads. They've committed collectively to 30,000 apprenticeships by 2020. Because of the greater flexibility for public authorities to factor in social considerations, the old social clauses, Lady Thatcher abolished in the 1980s, the old social clauses are starting to come back, particularly from Labour-controlled, socialist-controlled governments. So you've had a number of recent agreements between those local authorities and the trade unions, which cover not only union membership, union access, collective agreements, but training and apprenticeship training as well. And the picture here is of the lead of our trade union organisation and the chief executive of HS2. They've just signed an agreement which covers not only terms and conditions, but also commitments around local employment and apprenticeships. Impact of Brexit and politics. Well, I won't go on about that too much. I won't share my grief with you. But clearly one of the drivers around Brexit was the perception of people being sucked in to the UK and local people not getting opportunities, not getting trained. And in terms of politics, we now have a Prime Minister from the Conservative Party talking about worker directors. Now, in Sweden, of course, that's hardly news, but in Britain, it's interesting. And we'll have to see how that develops, obviously with Trump as well in the United States. If like the responsibility of national governments to look after their own populations first. Lots of problems with that, but then there are potentially opportunities in this area as well. Do you want to talk?
Right, I
hand back to Mike.
I'm just aware of a time. Lisa stood up, so that means I've got to be off. Oops.
Oh, gosh.
Let me
hold. Oh, right. Thanks. Oh, right, yeah. This was just, we've been using several dashboards to present key information to our board. This is done through the Sustainability Committee. So the key thing here is about measurement and monitoring, the things that Andrew's mentioned, but also making sure there's high visibility, high-level visibility, and that we're getting what we call the air cover, the senior management helping us to deliver these things. So this is how we do that, through the dashboards. What I really wanted to focus on, just to finish off, though, is we've done a lot of innovation on Crossrail. There is a website called i3P. All our innovation has actually migrated across to i3P. So if you have any interest in any of the things that we've been talking about and much more, it's here. So hopefully there's some good lessons learned through this that might be able to provide you with some assistance in terms of your delivery here in Sweden. We also have, this was the formal opening of Crossrail, and when it was renamed, the Elizabeth line. One other thing, we also have a Learning Legacy website. So if you type in Crossrail Learning Legacy, again, there's a wealth of information there that covers the content that we've talked about today, plus much more content. So again, please do go on that website, and if you can find anything there of interest, then that would be great. Okay, thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. And this is a great image of Elizabeth II. She looks quite right at home.
Oh, yes.
A couple of apprentices there.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike and Dave, for this presentation from this impressive and extensive project. You mentioned, I think you said 15 billion pounds?
Yes.
Quite a number, and it shows that with the purchasing power, you can actually accomplish things. Yes. You can change things, which I think this is a great example of. Feel free to put your hand up if you have a question for either of the speakers today. I think we have one right now. Please, if you would introduce yourself quickly.
Hello, my name is Annat. I wondered, do you have a conversation with Trafikverket? We're building some tunnels, Förbifarten. I just hope you have, because I think we can learn a lot from you.
They came to see us 18 months ago?
About 18 months ago, I think, yes.
Yes.
And they keep in touch with you all the way?
Are they here?
We're
not here, are they?
But no, you're right. I think that contact has gone a little bit, so we're more than happy to renew that communication.
I really hope you do. Thank you.
Any further questions in the hall? I'll interject with some. Michael, you mentioned some of the assessment methodologies that you were using. You mentioned SQL and Brian.
Brian, yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about the value of using these methods, the pros and cons?
Yeah. I've used both of these evaluation methodologies for some time, and as I say, I know that SQL is being used just very recently on a couple of projects here in Sweden. Now, I must say, for us, it's been a very interesting exercise. The requirements that we've set in our project through a thing called the environmental minimum requirements, which are effectively conditions, if you like, that complemented the Act, the Crossrail Act, does set the performance criteria at quite a high level. So what we've found is that the use of SQL and BREEAM is bringing some incremental improvement above that. It depends very much on where you set your initial bar, but I think there's no doubt that it has helped to improve performance. If you don't have such strict requirements, then I think you'll find that the improvement that you can get, the incremental improvement, is much greater. If you have your bar set quite high, then you will still get some benefit, but perhaps not so much. And I think the question then becomes not just the value of having the certificate that tells you you've achieved a certain level of performance, but there's a cost that comes with that as well, because you have to pay for the service, and you have to balance the additional costs of running the service with the value of the public relations, the PR value of the the certificate, I think. Yeah.
And with regards to sustainability, what are some of your current challenges? I mean, this is a long-reaching project.
Yes.
What are you working on right now with regards to that?
Right. I mean, there's no doubt that carbon performance is right up there. It's a big issue for us, as it is, you know, in most places in the world. I think the important thing is that while we're managing our carbon, we have to get the priorities right. The construction-related carbon is only 15% of the overall carbon footprint for the project. 85% of it is in the operations of the actual railway. So it's important that, you know, we've designed and given over, or we will be giving over to the infrastructure operator, a very efficient railway. What we have no control over is how they choose to run it.
Classic.
So we certainly hope that they will, you know, embrace you know, what we've provided them with and run that. So there's ongoing discussions with that. So I think that's a great challenge for us. Also, I become increasingly concerned that in focusing on carbon, that we use it too much as a proxy for all the other environmental concerns and social performance concerns. So it's important not to lose sight of those other considerations as well. Very
fair point. And Andrew, with regards to your employment relations issues, I loved how you visualized the performers of your supply chain. I think that was very interesting. And how, if you have cooperated with your employment agency or job center, our equivalent of Arbetsförmedlingen, when you were looking for these apprenticeships, for an example, how was your cooperation with that agency?
Yeah, I think, specifically on jobs, I think I'll talk about in regard to jobs. It was Job Centre Plus, which is the national organisation, has local branches. I think what we found that we had to do was there was very much an educational exercise that had to be undertaken. I think there is an assumption within the job service and within local authorities that these big projects are simply going to take people as they come, that the requirements are fairly low, and that there's not an awful lot of preparation needs to go in to getting people ready, job ready. In fact, the local advisors in the job centres had to be taught what the industry was looking for. They had to understand the expectations, and that was an educational exercise. And as I said, ultimately, we had to do a kind of a pre-assessment, a pre-sifting process to get people to a position where the employers were enthused. I think because we had it in the contract for a long time, the assumption was the employers had to employ these people, whether they liked it or not. And a lot of the resistance that we faced was as a result of the employers perceiving the candidates that they were getting as not being the candidates that they wanted. And so we had to bring, if you like, the two sides together, the supply and the demand together, and eventually we did it. It took a long time, and it takes a lot of effort. It's not easy.
It isn't. And you mentioned before that one of the groups that you were working with were the long-term unemployed. Mm-hmm. Were there any other groups that you specifically targeted in this initiative?
Well, the long-term unemployed, as I said, it was a tough one, and that was with the job centres and with the local authorities. I wanted, to be honest with you, I wanted to do something around Black, Asian and minority ethnic. I said that the figures look pretty good, but it simply reflects the population. I was looking really for opportunities to upskill people. And I was looking for a partner. I was looking for an organisation that we could partner with who had access to people, who had access to networks, and there weren't any. We were able to partner with Women into Construction. Mm-hmm. They had large numbers of women on their database. They had a lot of experience on arranging work placements. They knew what the industry wanted. But in terms of Black and Asian minority ethnic populations, there's nothing. And the reality is within London, within some of the communities within London, there isn't an interest in construction. Tower Hamlets, one of the big boroughs that Crossrail goes through, also one of the 5 Olympic boroughs, very low levels of interest in construction. And so you look for somebody to help you, and there isn't anybody. So where there is somebody, a partner like Women's Construction, it works. Perhaps we should have invented our own organization to help us, but there wasn't that for Black and Asian minority ethnic people.
And yet, very impressive results.
Yes.
From our scale, our side of things.
Well, yeah. I would say that comes through putting it in the contract. Could we put more into the contract in terms of more demanding requirements, numerically? Definitely. I think 3 million, one output per 3 million, was pretty soft on the contractors, pretty soft. We could have been a lot harder. And one of the things that has happened with the subsequent developments is that other clients in transport infrastructure are now saying, we want 1 apprentice for every 3 million. That's not what Crossrail said. Crossrail said, we want 1 apprentice for 1 year for 3 million. So 1 apprentice actually could be 10 million. But the infrastructure clients are now saying, and I don't know whether that's because they thought Crossrail was too soft, or whether I think they misunderstood what the Crossrail requirement was, but they are putting into the contracts now 1 apprentice per 3 million, which I think is a much more demanding target, but achievable, provided that you enforce it, you monitor it. Because it's no good just putting things into contracts, as you know.
I think those are some great final words about enforcement and following up. And we are so thankful for you bringing your experiences from this massive project, and we hope to hear more from you in the future. I hope you stay for lunch in an hour, or join us for lunch in an hour.
That's why we came.
The Swedish cuisine, the famous Swedish cuisine. And let's round this one off with a great applause again. Mike and Andrew, thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
I've got a little gift for you.